We're live on YouTube and we're live on Facebook.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everybody, or actually good evening, because Charlie is you're in the Eastern time zone, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So it's 7 o'clock there, 4 o'clock here, which is why I brewed myself a cup of tea. After all, we are going to England in this book. So
that's true. Yeah.
Yep, there we are. So Charlie's new book, The Enigma Affair, and we do have autographed copies, but not a huge number left. And thank you, Charlie, for signing them for us. Always appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So you can still order one from the Poison Pen. PK, can you put the order link into the comments field?
I'll do that.
Yep, if you would do that, that way anyone watching who would like to do a quick order, it's sort of like Instagram to do it this way. Anyway, you can order one of our remaining autographed copies. So Charlie, you're a bookman through and through. We've been together in one form or another for all of your books, which I have truly enjoyed. And it seems as though you find something literary or something bookish irresistible.
Yeah, this was a little bit different for me because I sort of set out to write a thriller, but there's no way I was going to avoid having rare books and manuscripts and librarians and libraries be a part of that. So, one of the main characters of this book is a small town librarian, although as we gradually find out, she is other things as well. It begins with one of the first things they go looking for is a book. And in fact, they go looking for a copy of The Key to Rebecca, the Ken Follett thriller, which was one of the first thrillers that I ever read as a young man. And so it sort of stuck with me and is a book like the Enigma Affair that is somewhat about cryptography. So I thought it would be a nice little nod to have that be in there. And then, there are libraries in some different places in Europe where they go, and there's different books and manuscripts that come into the story. And so even though it's a thriller, you can still definitely have some rare books involved in what goes on.
Basically, what we have here is a quest novel, or in its way, a treasure hunt. Actually, in many ways, it resembles the Da Vinci Code.
I think I didn't have a particular model for this book, but certainly I'd read Dan Brown, I'd read Ken Follett, I'd read other thrillers, and I really liked the idea of putting my protagonist in mortal peril in the first sentence. Just right from the start, that you could tell the reader what kind of book this was going to be. That this was not going to be a slow burn this time around.
I'll read you the first sentence. It wasn't just the bullet passing by Patton's left ear that concerned her. And Patton is, in fact, librarians. There, Pat can testify. There are a large number of librarians on the Poison Pen staff. I don't know, PK, do we actually have assassin skills among the staff? Can we kill customers if they misbehave?
With our power of shushing.
No, seriously, I'm a librarian. I was a librarian at the Library of Congress and went through library school. Pat is a librarian and continues to work in sort of a version of it. Susan is at the library. John Charles is a retired librarian. Who else over the course of time? David Hunenberg, when he worked for us, was a major librarian. Lisa Holstein, our blogger, is in fact still an employed librarian.
Patricia Harrington, yeah.
Yep, Pat was a librarian. So there's something. The hardest part about acquiring librarians for book selling is that librarians are trained to give it all away. It's a really bad idea if you're in retail.
Well, one of the things I've noticed in many librarians that I've known, and this was sort of part of the inspiration for Patton, I guess, is that a lot of librarians have hidden talents. We think that they're just back there behind the desk shushing, but there is a lot more going on than that. And that's certainly true with Patton. She, on the surface of it, looks like she's living in a small town in the North Carolina mountains. She's trying to make a pastry that she saw on the British baking show, and she works at the local public library. But there's bullets flying at her, so there's clearly something else going on. And her skill set, we discover as the novel progresses.
We do indeed. And actually, I'm not kidding, and all fun aside, librarians are actually at the moment with this banned book thing going on, Many of them are on front lines, and some of them may have actually been in physical danger. So, it's easy to think of them as bespectacled, sort of middle-aged people in dusty back rooms, but that's not true. And libraries have been transformed digitally. So, I think my degree in library science, because I have a master MSLS, it doesn't even exist anymore.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
you're actually, I know that you're a rare book guy, but are you a trained librarian also?
I am not a trained librarian, although I certainly have learned a lot about librarianship from my years as both an antiquarian bookseller and as a collector and a bibliographer, um, and just knowing so many librarians and visiting so many different kinds of libraries. On Tuesday, I have a book coming out, Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith, which is a religious biography of Lewis Carroll. And in the process of that, I worked in, Oxford College libraries. I got things from the British Library, from small private libraries, it took me to libraries all across the United States and Great Britain. So, but I certainly agree with what you say about librarians being on the front line, and that in the Enigma Affair, Patton makes that a very real thing. The bad guys, the villains in this novel, are a group of white supremacists who are sort of trying to follow in the footsteps of Heinrich Himmler. And to me, it wasn't anything at all unreasonable about showing a librarian as the kind of person who would stand up against that kind of thing, because I think we see that all the time.
Well, we'll get to why this is called the Enigma Affair, because enigma is a key word here. Now, let me just review Charlie's previous published work that I'm familiar with. His first book was called The Bookman's Tale, which right there tells you something. Then we have First Impressions. Then we have The Further Adventures of Ebenezer Scrooge. That was kind of your Christmas book in a way.
Yep.
The Lost Book of the Grail. But then Escaping Dreamland was somewhat different, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think, we were talking about this before we came on the air, about how the Enigma Affair, probably of all my books, is the easiest one to explain in just a sentence or two, to tell a potential reader. It's about a professional assassin and a small town librarian who team up to solve a 75-year-old Nazi mystery. You can do. Escaping Dreamland is probably my most difficult book to explain in just a sentence or two. It's much more of a character study about these four writers, and in particular, three of them living in New York City in 1906. And it weaves in different historical events, and it's about children's series books, the sort of books that so many of us grew up on, like the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. And it's about how stories echo down through generations and impact us in different ways at different points in our lives. And it's about a lot of other things too. It's about the search for identity and trying to figure out who we are and how we both project that and hide that in different societies. So I really enjoyed that book. I loved the research for that book. And the response from readers has been really wonderful. It's just a harder book to explain in a short period of time.
Well, it's a very layered book. I loved it. I mean, I loved, trawling back over childhood favorites, as you said. It was actually one of our books of the month last year, or was it the year before? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, it was 2020.
Okay. Anyway, it was. And as I said, Charlie has very kindly signed all our books, which is a prerequisite for one of our books being a book of the month. In most of our book of the month clubs, there are three that don't need signature. But anyway, I loved Escaping Dreamland. But I must say, I was really pleased to see you go in this kind of thriller direction here with the Enigma Affair. And I knew from the title that somehow or other, a key to this book was going to be the famous Enigma machine, and that you were probably going to have to go to Bletchley or contact. And, Bletchley was a long time ago. So, it's very unlikely that you're going to find a centenarian to help you in this quest. So you're going to need to find somebody familiar with the Enigma machine and how it worked, and familiar with Bletchley, who probably didn't serve during the war in Bletchley.
Yeah, my wife and I have been to Bletchley 3 different times. Once, and Bletchley Park, for those who don't know, is the place where the German Enigma code was broken by a group of British mathematicians and logicians and just overall clever people, including Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman and Dilly Knox and lots of others. And the first time we went to Bletchley, it was almost in ruins. I mean, there was no real museum there. You could sort of look around a little bit. And then they got some lottery money and turned it into a really proper museum. And then the most recent time I went was actually while I was working on this book. But for me, it all started in the late 1990s when I met a woman named Mavis Beatty, who shared my interest in Lewis Carroll. And we saw each other at Lewis Carroll events, and I had never heard of Bletchley. Not that many people had. It wasn't sort of, I mean, the secret was out, but not widely out at that point. And as I started to learn about it, somebody said, well, Mavis Beatty was at Bletchley. I thought, oh, wow. And I thought, I had no idea what she did there because there were thousands of people there who did all sorts of different things. And one time I got her to talk about it a little bit, but her husband had also been there, and her husband kind of, kept interrupting her to tell me his story. I was like, I really want to hear Mavis's story. And then after she passed away several years ago, my wife and I were at a book festival in England, and there was a panel about women in World War II. And this author on the panel said, there were two women who were largely responsible for shortening the war and for helping the Allies win World War II. And one of them was, and he gave the name of a spy that I didn't know about. And that was a fascinating story. And then he said the other one was Mavis Beatty. And I was gobsmacked. And when we did go back to Bletchley, when it was turned into a museum, her name's all over the place. She's right there with Alan Turing and a few other people whose names are on displays and on the wall. So she was really the person who drew me into that whole world and that whole story. Even though I didn't ever get a lot of the story from her directly, it made me feel like there was a personal connection there. And I later found out there was another acquaintance of mine, the mother of a very good friend of mine in England, and she was at Bletchley, and she was not a code breaker, but she maintained a lot of the equipment that they used in the code breaking, which was also an incredibly important job. So the idea of writing a book where, and one of the last time we went to Bletchley, somebody said something that was another thing that sort of set me on the course for this book. And that was one of the docents said, we still have in the archives at Bletchley thousands of undecrypted messages. And I think if you say that to a tourist goes, oh, that's kind of interesting. But if you say that to a novelist is like, ooh, I want to know about that. So the idea that my protagonist would discover an undecrypted Enigma message, and then for various reasons need to go to Bletchley to decrypt it, is kind of what started the novel on its journey.
Well, it's wonderful how, ideas sort of assemble themselves over bits and pieces, and often over time, people are constantly saying, where do you get your ideas? And, the answer is they're all over the place. There is no particular technique or formula. You just have to keep your eyes open and things occur to you. And then, they kind of begin to stick together. You get an idea here and an idea there, and then if they kind of stick them together, and then other ideas come, and then you begin to have a plot. However, one of the things you really emphasized, Charlie, and what you had to say was how seriously people took the Official Secrets Act. I mean, the reason that she didn't talk to you and all is that if you think about it, it would be impossible today for that kind of secrecy. I mean, everybody has in their possession a computer that could have done all the work of Enigma in spades. And not only, I think, do people not necessarily respect that whole idea of secret keeping, but it's almost impossible to prevent leakage one way or another.
Yeah, I think it's almost hard for us to wrap our heads around what a big secret it was and how well kept it was. I mean, you had upwards of 10,000 people who even their own families thought they were working at a radio manufacturing plant,
And they didn't talk about it when the war was over.
And the Official Secrets Act said they had to keep it a secret for 50 years because, at that point, the assumption was the Russians will be the next enemy, and we don't want them to know that we've broken this code. Yeah. And nobody knew. Nobody outside of Bletchley knew until I think it was 1974 when somebody wrote a book about it. And of course, by that time, cryptography had moved on, and it was, but even the people who even though when the story started to come out, most of the people who were there still wouldn't really talk about it, because by the time you've not talked about something for 25 or 30 or 40 years,
Yeah.
You're just in the habit of not talking about it. But I think there were two monumental human achievements that happened at Bletchley, and one was the code breaking, but the other equally monumental was keeping the whole thing a secret. It just
Well, that's absolutely
boggles the
true. And of
mind.
course, there was so much pioneering work done here and basically, modern computers. And,
Yeah.
Alan Turing's story is so tragic. I saw a really fascinating play before I even really knew who Alan Turing was. I can't remember where it was. It was a small theater. And, the fact that he committed suicide at the end, was so terrible. And, England, I think it was because he was homosexual when it was still a crime. And I'm trying to remember that. And it was just awful the way he was persecuted for it and all the rest of it, deemed a security risk after, he managed to do this work with Enigma and crack the code. They actually had the nerve to say he was a security risk, which I can hardly believe. I'm trying to remember when England decriminalized homosexuality. I mean, he almost made it.
Yeah. It was just incredibly sad. And when one of the things they have on the wall at Bletchley is a framed letter from, I think it's Gordon Brown, the prime minister at the time, signed it. But it's essentially the official UK government apology to Alan Turing. And that's nice, but what I mean, as I wanted to see the official UK government apology to the other 19,000 or so men that were prosecuted under those laws, or the who knows how many tens or hundreds of thousands of men who couldn't be their true selves because of those laws. And I mean, it just
well, come on, we could go
really
all the way
sad.
back to Oscar Wilde, kiddo.
Yeah, exactly.
We could recite the ballad of, the Ballad of Reading Gaol
Reading
and
Gaol,
all the rest. And another person whose life took a tragic end, in part because of that. He wasn't very wise about how he challenged it. But, to some degree, he was self-destructive. But anyway, we digress. Let's go back here and talk about librarian Patton Harcourt. I think it's important to remember that Patton is her first name, not her last name. And Patton Harcourt has been living in this small town and keeping a very low profile. But I think she's always been prepared for something to happen. And in fact, something happens because Nemo, the assassin, the professional assassin, the anonymous assassin, shows up in her kitchen.
Yeah.
So Nemo is an interesting name, and so's Patton. Why did you name them those particular way?
I really love to think long and hard about names. And Nemo, of course, is a word that means nothing, and most famously Captain Nemo in Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And I had reread 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea when I was working on Escaping Dreamland, because I was reading the books of my childhood, and that was one of them. And so it may be that I had that sort of in the back of my head. But he is a character who has lived all of his adult life in the shadows. He has many false identities, but not any real identity in a way, because of the career that he's chosen. And so the idea that he would go by the moniker of Nemo, much like the captain of the Nautilus, that made a lot of sense to me. And then Patton comes from a long generational military family, and is named after multiple different generals. I think her middle name is Jackson, so she's named after Patton Jackson Harcourt, so after Stonewall Jackson and George Patton. But I also like having slightly unusual names. For one thing, for me as a reader, if a name is a little bit unusual, it just helps me remember it and remember that name belongs to that character. If everybody's named Jane and John and Jim and Sarah, there's nothing wrong with those names, but my 60-year-old brain will get those names confused in my head after a while. I remember talking to one writer who said that she never gave two characters names that had the same first letter. So there would never be a John and a Jim in the same novel, because she didn't, she felt like it would be confusing. But,
that's one of the things the Nazis do that really just still drives me crazy. It's hard to keep them straight. you've got Himmler, you've got Heydrich, you've got
Yeah.
Hitler. I mean, they obviously missed the memo about,
About,
you gotta be, yeah,
And,
it's hard.
And then, yeah, and speaking of names and of Himmler, Himmler is also a character in this book.
Right.
As a lot of my books are told in sort of multiple timelines, and this one, the vast majority of the book is in, it's not quite the present day. I think it's set in 2015. But there are some short flashbacks to the World War II period. So because these, as I said, our modern day villains are sort of styling themselves after Heinrich Himmler. And so we go back and see some of the things that he's doing that sort of provide the background for this mystery that they're trying to solve. And I created scenes and I created characters for him to interact with, but all the stuff that he does and the sort of strange occult things that he is fascinated by in my book are all just based in history. He was into some very, very strange stuff.
So Patton is cooking in her kitchen, and Nemo, the professional assassin, shows up. So why doesn't he kill her? I mean, this is all in the beginning, so we can talk about this.
Well,
part.
I mean,
He's there to kill her, right?
He claims that he is not the person who's shooting at her. And she has to make a pretty quick decision about, okay, either this is the guy who was shooting at me and I need to shoot back or try to get away from him or whatever, or he's telling the truth and the two of us need to get out of here because somebody's shooting at us. And so she decides to believe him. She decides to trust her intuition and believe that he is actually there to try to get her out of harm's way. Even though why he's there is a complicated reason that she will learn over quite a few pages as they go on the run. But and so the book begins, within a few pages, the two of them are on the run together, and they're on the run together for most of the novel. They do get joined by other people along the way, and they change the direction that they're running in and the reason that they're running for multiple times during the novel. But they become this sort of unlikely pair of allies. And they're in a situation that I learned when I started thinking about looking at the book and thinking, how did I conceive of a thriller? What was in my mind that it said these are the things that are in a thriller? Who taught me that? And I think it was Alfred Hitchcock. Really, the more I think about it, is his films. And there's something you see in so many of his films where the protagonist or the group of protagonists are kind of on their own. They're being pursued by both the villains and by the law enforcement, the peacekeepers, and so that certainly happens with Patton and Nemo in this book. And I think there are a lot of things that I learned from Hitchcock that show up in this novel.
Yeah, I was thinking Cary Grant, racing away from the crop dusting plane and the whole thing. Yeah, that's
there's so many elements from, if you take a film like North by Northwest, you have the apparently ordinary person who's thrust into extraordinary circumstances right at the very beginning. I learned a lot about pacing, that you do have these very intense set pieces like the famous crop duster piece, or the piece where he's been forcibly gotten drunk and he's driving the car down this twisty road. But then those pieces alternate with these sort of quieter, slower sections. And as you get closer to the end of the film, or in my case, closer to the end of the novel, those action sequences come closer and closer together. You're sort of building the speed as you go along. And Hitchcock does all of that. Yeah. And so I certainly learned a lot from, I started watching his films in high school.
I think Hitchcock had an intuitive understanding. Let's face it, a thriller really rises and falls more on the character of the villain, of the antagonist, than it does on the character of the protagonist, which, as you say, the protagonist can be an ordinary person suddenly thrust into extraordinary circumstances. But the bad guy is the bad guy from the beginning. And, a really great thriller does require a worthy antagonist. And it's different than a mystery. I mean, you've written, because the whole question is who's going to prevail in a thriller. It's not who did it. Sometimes why it happened can be important, but largely what it comes down to is who's going to prevail, you know, the in this case, Patton and Nemo, or is it going to be these other characters? And they generally require you to move across a landscape. You can't really write a thriller, you know, if it's like in The Vicarage. I
Yeah.
just read a new short story.
There's not a lot of closed room thrillers. I don't think.
No, there really isn't. And you know, there's a new book out called Marple, which various modern crime, and I loved reading it. Val McDermott rewrote Murder at the Vicarage. It's the second murder at the Vicarage. But one of the most interesting Miss Marple stories, because you know, there she is in St. Mary's Mead, the little village. So what are you going to do with that? Because I think it's Alyssa Cole, but I might be wrong. Anyway, the title of the story is Miss Marple Takes Manhattan. And you know, they bring her across, and it's much more of a thriller than it is a closed room thing, because she is in fact, you know, out of her little closed element and thrust into Manhattan.
Yeah, and I think that again, that's probably something that I learned from films like North by Northwest, that you not only is the action of the story moving forward, but your protagonists are quite literally moving forward. And in this book, we move from North Carolina to England to Munich to Prague to you know, other places, and it was fun to research those places, because I didn't get to go to all of those places. I've been to Bletchley many times, well, 3 times, and I'd been to I did go to Prague while I was working on this book. But one of the great tools that I discovered for, you know, writing a novel in a small town in Germany that you've never been is Google Street View. I would literally go along and just sort of go down a street and look and say, yeah, I want my character to live on this street, and this is what the houses look like on this street, and this is what the foliage looks like on this street, and you know, this is how wide the street is, and this is where it leads, and this is where the nearest train station is. And it's just it was a fantastic resource to be able to sort of virtually visit the places that I wanted to have in the novel that I wasn't able to visit in person.
But you have to be very careful of the topography, because one of the problems Dan Brown had was using Google Street View to write about Paris, is that if you're on a street, you don't see that the buildings can block something, you know.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So I mean, Google Street View is great, but you do have to be careful.
Yeah, it's just part of. I mean, I would certainly wouldn't be the only thing I would use, but it's just one of the tools that helps. And just the details of the maps that we can get now, where if I wanted to send somebody off, you know, on not even on a road, on just a little sort of path through a field, you know, you can see those on an aerial shot on Google Earth or whatever. So, you know, I don't have to send somebody off on a actual pre-existing path through a field, but it's kind of fun when I have the opportunity to do that. You know?
So where does the 75-year-old document, where does it crop up? Where do we first encounter the document?
So
which is sort of the MacGuffin, if there is a MacGuffin.
Yeah, if there is a MacGuffin, yeah. So Patton has a friend named Jasper who is who fought in World War II, and who was part of the unit that liberated the Dachau concentration camp. And unbeknownst to her, on the occasion of that liberation, he acquired this document, and has sort of kept it as a not really memento, because he feels a lot of guilt about what he did that day. And it's, you know, I read a lot about what happened that day, and there were, you know, obviously liberating the camp. It was great that they liberated the camp, and there were obviously war crimes being committed by the people who were running the camp, but there were also, you know, instances where just without even asking what people were up to or how long they'd been there, they just lined up all the Germans and just shot them, you know. And so Jasper has very mixed feelings and guilt about. So he holds on to this document sort of to remind himself of what he considers both a moment when he did a great service to humanity, and also maybe a moment when he did a disservice to humanity at the same time. And so, but not knowing anything about it, not knowing what it says or whether it's important. And it's only through a series of other circumstances that we discover that it is important, even 75 years later, that it may have information that could be very important to either the success or failure of these new age Aryan supremacists.
As we've moved away in distance, we realize, I mean, it's easy to think that we know about Nazi looting and how tragic that was. In fact, there's news today that American museums, or at least in New York City, are going to be required to actually put up signage that says that, whatever this thing in the museum is, was looted during the war. So we know about that. And if you watch the Monument Men or equivalent, we know that the Russians came swooping in and, Impressionists went off to be hidden at the Hermitage Museum and so forth. But the truth is there were Americans who took a lot of stuff too.
Oh, sure.
And, wars like that. I mean, soldiers happen upon stuff, don't necessarily, sometimes they know it's valuable. Sometimes it's just a souvenir. All kinds of reasons. But, there's plenty of stuff that went missing here in the United States. And this is an example of one. And without going into it, I think the circumstances that you paint around that make that entirely plausible. And of course, what we know is that, I'm trying to remember, it's Himmler and not Heydrich, right?
It's Himmler,
Yeah. All of those, the upper Nazi guys were really greedy about, looting, trying to, it's interesting to me. I wonder if any of them, other than Hitler, who was, nuts, really thought that they were going to create a 1,000-year Reich and, just do it, or whether they understood that they ought to grab the spoils while they could, because eventually this wasn't going to work. One nation against the entire world was bound. It's the lesson Putin forgot, which is.
Denial is a strong force. I mean, you see Hermann Göring, Göring probably looted more art than any other single Nazi, and he had drawn up plans for this massive Hermann Göring museum of art, that was this huge, very kind of Nazi architecture meets brutalism sort of building. That was going to house, tens of thousands of works of art, virtually all of which he had, either stolen or forced fleeing Jewish families to sell at pennies on the dollar. And so I think they probably did. But one of the things that this book also touches on, going back to my obsession with books, is that books were also one of the things that moved around a lot during the war. I've just been listening to this book about the history of the library, and I just got to the part about World War II. And, millions of books were destroyed, were burned, either intentionally or as a result of military action. But also lots of books were taken from one country to another country. A lot of books were taken into Germany, but then near the end of the war, a lot of books were taken from Germany into the Soviet Union, and books moved around a lot. And a work of art that is valued at $30 million is a little easier to trace and have a court battle over than a book that might be worth $30, or even a rare manuscript that might be worth $30,000. And so many of those books, especially the ones that disappeared into the Soviet Union, we still have no idea where they are, even all these years later.
Well, we say book, but that's a generic term for what in many cases were very valuable manuscripts. Europe's libraries, after all, printing started in Germany. I've been to Mainz, Germany, and spent time, in fact, in the Gutenberg Museum, and actually been to a lot of European libraries, and there were many of them in Germany. You can still in Austria.
Oh yeah.
Magnificent libraries. If you go down the Danube, there's a monastery with a magnificent library. It's one of the, I'm trying to remember where it is but everybody who goes up and down the Danube in a cruise boat eventually ends up in this particular monastery library. There's a magnificent one in Hungary as you're driving up towards Vienna, for example. So when you say book, it embraces a very wide variety of
large thing. And I thought, there's a character in this novel who is trying to repatriate books and sort of, lesser items that are less valuable than giant paintings and Van Goghs and this sort of thing. And of course, like a lot of things in this novel, it's maybe not exactly what it looks like on the face of it. And that brought up, dealing with those books and trying to figure out what was going on with those books. It's interesting I found when I'm writing a thriller that my characters, I had my main characters ahead of time, but a lot of the smaller characters grow out of the needs of the story, because I would need a character who had, in the words of Liam Neeson, a specific set of skills,
Yeah.
And so at dealing with these repatriated books, one of the things I need is I need a character who understands rare books and who understands forgery. And ideally he needs to be in North Carolina, where these other characters are located. And it suddenly occurred to me that I knew somebody like that, and that was Peter Byerly, the hero of The Bookman's Tale, my first novel. So one of the things that this novel features is the return of Peter Byerly. He's a very minor character in this novel. He's only in a couple of scenes, but for those people who want to know what he's up to about 20 years after the action of The Bookman's Tale, you get to catch up with Peter a little bit in this book. As the need for a bookman arose, it became clear that he would be the right person for the job.
Absolutely. Well, I spoke earlier about the fact that if you're going to Bletchley, it's not likely that anybody who actually worked on the Enigma machine and so forth, and Bletchley is still there or still active, whatever. So we need a character who, in fact, is going to be able to operate the Enigma museum, the Enigma machine, and help with this message, help decode it. And so we get Ruthie Drinkwater, another interesting name. We have a mayor here in Scottsdale, a famous mayor named Drinkwater. So it was funny to see her name. He's no longer the mayor, he died, but he was mayor here for Lord forever. I think he eventually ended up being called Mr. Scottsdale or something. So an interesting name. And then I know I mean, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but I do have to ask you this because we spoke about Alan Turing and the homosexual part. Is Ruthie, is there as kind of a female balance to Alan Turing, a modern day?
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to incorporate queer characters in my novels without making a huge deal about it, just sort of normalizing it. I think especially in this novel, I mean, in Escaping Dreamland, you have a queer character living in New York City in 1906, and that requires a lot of explication because it was just very different. It meant something very different in 1906 than what it means now. But in this novel, Patton is a lesbian, and that's just kind of like not a big deal. It's not a gigantic important plot point. I'm not trying to make a big statement about homosexuality or anything. It's just in the same way that some other character might have red hair, or some other character might be a book collector. It's trying to just normalize that and make it not, this is a gay character, but just, that's just part of who she is. And so Ruthie is sort of an old fling that she had many years ago when they were at this conference about cryptography and mathematics and whatnot. And so, it occurs to her that if she needs somebody to help her out with this code breaking job, maybe she can kind of use her charm to get an old flame, rekindled a little bit in order to.
Ruthie actually understands how to use the Enigma machine.
Yeah, because Ruthie works as a docent at Bletchley, so she knows how to work the machine called the bomb, which is this machine that Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman invented and is really in many ways the first modern computer. But they invented that to sort of reduce the number of possible settings. The Enigma machine has 154 million possible settings, right? And you have to know which one it is to break the code for that day. And I read someplace that this just boggles my mind. That means if you tried a different setting every second from the time of the Big Bang until now, you still wouldn't have tried them all. That's how many different settings there are. But Turing invented this machine called the bomb with the help from Gordon Welchman, and working on work that Polish cryptographers had done earlier. And that would reduce the number of possibilities down to just a few hundred. If you started out with, your code breakers had to come up with what's called a crib first, a guess at what 2 or 3 of the words might be. And so I needed somebody who knew how to use that machine, because they actually all of the original ones were destroyed at the end of the war because, again, they didn't want the Russians to find out about it. But a group of enthusiasts got together, I think it's starting in the late 90s, and decided they were going to try to rebuild one from the original plans. It took them about 12 years to do it, because you can't just run down to your corner shop and buy the parts that you could buy in 1941 or whatever. But it's done. It's there, and it's at Bletchley. And if you go on certain days, you can actually see it, being operated. So I needed to have a character who could operate that machine. And Ruthie Drinkwater is that.
Here she was, right?
Yeah.
How handy. So one of the things that is pervasive still, post-Nazi and whatever, is some of the lost loot. So there are potential treasure hunts that people still think they might be able to find things that disappeared and never to be seen again. So we have this encrypted message, and we have Himmler, and some of the top Nazis were, they were really nuts, or they wanted to believe in some of the German mythology. I sort of think, Wagner had a lot to do with the Nazis, because it was so big. The ring. I once flew to Milan to spend a week at La Scala, because I'm an opera nut, and I'd never been to La Scala, and I realized that I'd never been to a ring cycle, and any real opera person probably ought to do that. But I had been so put off by watching Wagner in translation. I love the music, but I, really horrified by much of the libretti. But I thought, okay, I'm going to soldier my way through this. And Daniel Barenboim, who I'd never seen, was the conductor. So it was, it was a great thing. But while I was watching it in Italy with Barenboim, Jewish, Italian, the whole 9 yards, that whole Ring of the Nibelung mythology and all, these guys bought into it. I mean, in a way, Tolkien, Lord of the Rings to a great degree is parallels, although it comes from the Mabinogian, but there's a lot of parallels or things drawn from the Nibelung story. In fact, it's just come back, hasn't it? Because we have a new prequel to the Lord of the Rings. I only watched one or two of them, and I couldn't quite get into it, but I'm going to give it another shot. I've watched the Peter Jackson twice, I think. I watched it on a flight home from New Zealand, which is, as you know, long. I think I watched all three of the Peter Jackson movies on Air New Zealand because I couldn't sleep. But anyway, all of that together, it does support a myth of racial superiority. It does involve, treasure hunts and, the power of gold, the power of greed, gold, alchemy, whatever it all is. And I thought it was interesting that, Himmler anyway bought into that, didn't he? He's known.
Yeah, I mean, I think Himmler as much as anyone else. I mean, certainly Goring, Goring was fascinated with the whole idea of Aryan supremacy, and but Himmler approached it almost as an academic study. I mean, he created this unit whose job was essentially to track down all these myths, these stories, anything they could do to prove Aryan.
Well, he wanted Wagner to be real.
Exactly. That's basically, in a nutshell, that's it. But at the same time, he would pursue all these different sorts of occult things, whether it was witchcraft or just any. When you see something like Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then you read about what Himmler was really up to, it is not far-fetched at all. It's kind of right in their wheelhouse, and in ways, it's actually much more reasonable than some of the stuff he was into, because we know there was actually an Ark of the Covenant at one point. Whether it's still out there or not, we don't know. But it was a real artifact. And one of the reasons I wanted to send them to Prague is I came across this article that many years after the war, I think 20 or 30 years, I can't remember exactly how long, but quite a long time after the war, someone at the National Library in Prague discovered that in that library, they had the 11,000 volumes of occult books that Heinrich Himmler had collected during the war. And I think, I make the assumption, and I think it's probably a pretty reasonable one, that by collected, that most of those, or certainly many of those, and the more valuable ones, were probably stolen. So I get to, dramatize that to a certain extent. But that's what sent me to Prague. And we actually, my wife and I went to Prague. Just a funny little research story that we were there with a couple of friends of ours, and we're walking through the streets of this, unbelievably beautiful and historic city, and they're all looking at these beautiful buildings and things. And I keep looking down back alleys, and I'm looking into, along the side of the street. And finally, my friend said, why do you keep looking in places that are, so ordinary? I said, well, I need to know where to park. And he said, well, we don't have a car. I said, no. I have a character who has to park a van in Prague, and I just don't know how parking here works. So sometimes your research is fairly mundane in terms of just how do you park a van in Prague? But, eventually you sort of do your best to figure it out.
Not easy. No, it's a beautiful city. I've been there 2 or 3 times, and I've been to the National Library in Prague. Actually, I've been to everywhere in your book except for the Switzerland part, which I thought was interesting. But anyway, Charlie, it's a wonderful book. And, for anybody who likes biblio mysteries or treasure hunts or, librarians with special skills or assassins, it's a wonderful combination of different, I want to say ingredients, but that makes it sound like you made a cake or something. But nonetheless, it is a wonderful collection of different ingredients that power the story. And it's a pretty hefty book too. It's 534 pages. No, it's
well, so now I have to say, you're looking at the ARC, which
I am.
they printed, for some reason, there was some problem with the printing of the ARC, and they printed it with very wide margins. Yeah. So it's actually
not just wide margins, but look at the leading.
Yeah. So the actual book is 320 pages.
Oh, okay. All right. Because when I picked this up, I thought, good Lord. But you're right.
I thought the same thing. I thought, did I write a super long book? And then I realized that it was the leading and the margin.
Yeah.
So,
I've said this at events at the store, and people are sort of surprised. What I get are these, you can see the size of this.
Yeah.
What I get, because I have to do this months ahead of publication date, is what's called an advanced reading copy. Called an ARC, ARC for short. Okay. And often when I go down to the store to actually do an event with the author in the book, I'm amazed when I see the book. It's different size, might have a different cover. There may have been corrections to it. And, sometimes I'm working from, from the wrong page, so to speak, but that's just how it works, because it's virtually impossible to run a large events program without preparing for it. You can't just do it at the spot. Charlie and I could not have this conversation.
We do sometimes make changes after the ARCs come out. I don't think there were any significant changes in this book, but I can't remember if we caught this before or after the ARC. But on the cover, if you look closely, you can see the little keys of the Enigma machine itself there in the background. And the first version of that cover that came to me, I was just about to approve it and say, yep, this is fine. And then I suddenly noticed that the keys were not in the right order.
No, they're not.
They had used a typewriter keyboard instead of the Enigma keyboard, and the Enigma keyboard, they're in a slightly different order. So we had to go back. I said, no, you've got to put them in the order of the.
Sort of hard to see it, but if I point out, see the little
you can see them there.
The alphanumeric stuff in it. Well, it's really been a joy to talk to you, Charlie. Let's call Pat up and see if there are any comments or questions from the audience. There he is.
Hey, how's it going?
It went great.
All right, let me
wonderful
take
time.
a look here. So I know that Mark from California says hello to everybody, along with Serena Penner from Ontario, Canada. Darlene Zerenberg Goblitz wants to point out that Escaping Dreamland was one of her favorite novels, and she's looking forward to reading this one. Thank you for your researching and writing.
Oh, that's very
sweet. Mark Sussick would like to know, what is your all-time favorite Alfred Hitchcock film?
Oh, I mean, that's a tough question, but I think if we were playing Desert Island Hitchcock films, I think it'd probably be North by Northwest. It's everything, the script, the art direction, the acting, the cinematography, the music. It's just like, I think it just punches on every level. And I mean, there's a lot of them that I like, but I think that's probably my favorite one.
I really love To Catch a Thief.
Yeah. I mean,
You know,
there's not any, there's very few that I am wishy-washy about. Some of the later ones, like
yeah, I was never
Topaz.
really fond of the birds. That
I'm not a big fan of Topaz, but then I kind of like Frenzy too, you know, and that's
Yeah.
one of the other ones too. But
You know, we were lucky. You know, his career lasted a long time. He spanned a lot of years and wasn't he the witness for the prosecution?
no, he didn't do that one, but he did do some. I mean, some of the early. I mean, I think 39 Steps is a great early one too, which of course has been
Robert
done
Downey?
now as a great stage adaptation of 39 Steps. It sort of makes it into a comedy thriller.
Right, with Robert Donat, which I saw that when I was very young. And then there's the whole Joan Fontaine on the train one. What's that one?
Well, there's Strangers on a Train is a good one.
Yeah,
Oh, you may be thinking of The Lady Vanishes.
that's it. The Lady Vanishes, right. Yep. He's
Lots
a
of good
marvelous man. But you're right, North by Northwest. But you know, it's hard to divorce Cary Grant. I mean, you know,
It is. But I mean, it was just interesting to me as I looked back on this novel. I thought, yeah, the course in thriller that I took was a course that was watching Alfred Hitchcock movies and also reading and listening to his interviews, and listening to his thoughts about, you know, how to create suspense. And I didn't consciously think about that while I was writing this book, but after I was done, I thought, oh yeah, that was back in the hard drive, you know.
So I could say, speaking of Alfred Hitchcock, that I think The Enigma Affair would make a really interesting movie.
It'd be fun, wouldn't it?
It would be fun, you know, and I mean, there's a lot of action, a lot of fascinating characters, high stakes, great landscapes.
There's certainly, you know, some of those action sequences when I'm working on those, I certainly sort of am running a film in my head, you know. That may not be the case with every scene in the book, but especially those, you know, when there's a chase or an explosion or a gunfight or I'm definitely thinking about how it looks on a screen and then kind of translating that onto the page.
Yeah, I think it would make a perfectly wonderful movie. I really do. Anything else, Pat?
Well, you know, there was a question about who's publishing your book, but is this your first or second time with Blackstone as your publisher?
It's my second and a half time with Blackstone. And the reason I say second and a half is I have a middle grade book coming out on Tuesday with a small publisher called Month 9, but Blackstone is doing the audiobook of that. And Blackstone started out as an audiobook publisher and then got into print. And they just do fantastic audiobooks. And it's really fun to get to participate in picking the narrator, which they allow me to do. And so I'm really excited about the audiobooks for both for the Enigma Affair and also for the Book of the Seven Spells, which comes out in a couple days. So yeah, this is my second full novel where Blackstone's doing both print and audio.
Blackstone's really punching up as far as print as a print publisher. They're doing some remarkable work, and they seem unswayed by trends. I mean, they're publishing a lot of books that I can't imagine one of the currently 5, possibly soon to be 4 major publishers would actually tackle. So I like working with them. They make it extremely easy for booksellers to stock their books. They're really a wonderful publisher.
I've had several booksellers thank me for introducing them to Blackstone and said that they've been really great to work with. And as an author, I've really enjoyed working with them. I feel like, if there's something I need to talk about, I can get a hold of somebody without any trouble. And they let me participate in things like the design and the picking the audiobook narrator and everything else. So.
That it?
They are really a fantastic publisher. I will agree with you.
One of Pat's favorite books, what is it? No Gods, No, I'm trying to remember the title.
No Gods, No Monsters, Gabriel Turnbull. Wonderful, wonderful horror novel. And really fascinating. Deb on YouTube just wanted to let you know that Joel and she both enjoyed this book. So
Great.
it's just getting really nice reviews, a lot of nice comments off of both platforms.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's a tricky, as you probably heard listening to us talk, it's a tricky book to talk about, because when you have a book that's all about sudden change of direction and what's going to happen next and secrets, and if you give any of that away, then you take some of the fun away from the reader. So that's why we sort of danced around some things in
I
this
know, and I
discussion.
did do one
You
spoiler.
have to,
I couldn't resist it, but actually, it's a wonderful book. Fortunately, I'm a speed reader, but actually, despite the size of this, I read it all in one afternoon, and I really, really enjoyed it. So I'm glad that we have some signed copies left. We could probably even get more if we sell out from Blackstone.
Absolutely.
So Charlie, thank you very much for doing that for us.
It's always a pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Enjoy your evening and your whole weekend, as a matter of fact. Good night.